Society welcomes you to this historical cemetery walk this afternoon. We thank the volunteers who made this program possible. I might mention also, for your convenience, there's a porta potty sitting over here just to the east of it. First, the Civil War veteran Doug Runn will present some information about Civil War soldiers who settled in Fillmore County. After his presentation, we will divide into our groups, each group with a guide, and visit the different grave sites. Some of the sites feature citizens who were well known in their time. Others were more obscure but had interesting lives. The tours will end back here at the monument where refreshments will be available. We wish you to enjoy this walk today. Doug?
Okay. In 1861, when the Civil War began, President Abraham Lincoln called for volunteers from the states and territories to fight the Confederates. Nebraska was not a state then, it was part of a territory that stretched from Kansas through the Dakotas over to Montana. 3,200 men volunteered to fight for the Union in that war. They fought well under General Ulysses S. Grant. Several monumental battles, these Nebraska volunteers took part. After the Civil War, a lot of them were even stationed out here on the prairie at the various forts along the Oregon, California, Mormon Trail to protect the pioneers who were headed west. At their retirement, or when they were released from the Army, they were given a chance to own land under the Homestead Act because they were veterans, and also their widows could get land. A lot of them came out here and helped make Fillmore County part of the 37th state of the Union called Nebraska. At the close of the war, they settled in this area, became farmers, and lived their life with their families. A lot of them stayed here and became part of this community and this county. Up on this hill here is a statue, a monument to these men. It was not dedicated until 1928 when the citizens decided they needed a monument to honor these Union veterans. On it, it says, soldiers, 1861-1865, Union defenders, American immortals, Grand Army of the Republic, dedicated this September 21st, which is getting pretty close, 1928. Underneath it says, an appeal to memory, a challenge to oblivion. Tablets were placed by Geneva citizens around the monument. There are a total of 216 names on that monument. Some are buried here. You'll notice when you walk around, you'll see a metal star, a plate from the GAR, recognizing them as soldiers that fought in these wars. There are other soldiers buried not only here, but in other county cemeteries, up at Fairmont, at Harmony, down south, and other private and pioneer cemeteries around the county. And you can see them as you visit these cemeteries, these men who fought for the Union. It's ironic that today we honor these veterans, but also the veterans before the Civil War, after the Civil War, and the wars of the modern era on this special day called Patriots' Day. We honor the men and women who passed away and died and gave their ultimate sacrifice on September 11th, 2001. So it's ironic that we have this day to honor these people and those. I have some things up here you can look at. You can go on your tour first and then come back and for refreshments. I've got some things here you can look at, and I'll be able to talk a little bit more. But I know you want to get on this tour. This is a fascinating one, different than last year, except for me, but everything else is different. So enjoy the weather. Last year we about froze, but this year it's going to be a great day. So with that in mind, happy trails.
We'll hold up their signs, and then you can find your guide. Have something to say, Diane?
Yeah, who's in A? How many? In A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. B? Hello, this is not a grade that most people pay much attention to. And I'm Dolores Hartman, and I am sort of being a teacher from the 1920s. I actually have been a teacher, but I didn't start in the 1920s. I'd like to speak to you as a girls' training school teacher from the 1920s. And teachers at that point lived on campus. Women staff members couldn't work if they were married. So if you took a job there, it was like, at least for teachers, like other jobs. If you were a teacher and you got married, you lost your job. And so the teachers there obviously got focused on girls as the primary focus of things. Here are buried the only 2 residents from the facility just over there, which isn't what it used to be, just west and north of where we're standing. These are the only 2 that never left Geneva. Okay. The facility was opened on March 14th of 1892 on land donated to the state by residents in this area, and it was named the Girls Industrial School originally. In 1923, the unicameral gave it the name of the Girls Training School because the shift was to more education. In 1967, it became the Youth Development Center Geneva, and in 1997, it became the Youth Rehabilitation and Treatment Center Geneva. And some of you remember those changes, probably. And it remained that until August 19th, 2019, when it was closed. Any girl up to age 18 could be sent to the facility because she was in trouble with the law. What that trouble was and how that worked changed over the years. You know, in the 1920s, she probably could have gone for shoplifting a piece of candy if somebody had chosen that, okay? It depended on the judge. By 2019, she had to have committed any number of offenses and been in any number of programs before she ever arrived. The average count in residents has varied over the years, but in the 1920s, the annual reports or biannual reports report that at about 150 to 200. And there were a lot of girls there, and the housing was quite different than it is now. When June and Clara arrived, the facility had that 150 to 200. Staff lived on campus, so you ended up with a community of about 250 people. And it became a community all on its own, and many people who were there labeled it as family. And there are letters included in old biennial reports to the Board of Control, the state reports, with letters from girls about how much it meant to them, and they had to, you know, convince the girls you can't come back if life gets hard. You have to go out and make it. And in the 1990s, Richard Wayland received, if some of you remember Richard Wayland received 2 different letters from an elderly woman who had been in the facility in the 1990s. For all I knew, she might have known June and Clara, who was so impressed in her later years what the facility had done for her that she sent some fairly large checks for what they called the Student Welfare Fund, which provided things the state didn't. So there, you hear what you hear, but there were a lot of people who really felt like the facility became a home, especially in these years. Now, Clara Alexander over there was born on December 9th, 1910 in Omaha. She came to the facility in March of 1925. So she was 15 or thereabouts. Probably 14 actually. And she died 3 years later in January of 1928. Many girls came to the facility and stayed until they were 21. They did find some homes for some of the girls, but a lot of them stayed there until they were of legal age. June was born June 10th, 1913, and she entered the Geneva facility a year after Clara died. So Clara died in 28. She came in 29 and died a year later in May of 1930. When they came to the girls' training facility, the superintendent was Lena Ward. Her assistant superintendent was her sister, Sudie Ward, which is probably not something we would do today. Clara lived with other black girls on campus because housing was segregated. There are pictures. The oldest picture that I'm aware of was in 1908, and it is in the canning facility, and there are black and white girls there. So it appears to me they worked together, but they didn't live together. The census tells us that June lived in a dormitory with Maud, Frida, Marjorie, Mildred, and Theda. Other girls, that would have been her group. And I can't determine where these two girls specifically lived. None of the buildings exist today that they would have had then. In your program, there's a picture of a white building with a portico and pillars. That was the administration building, and there is another building beside that they call the red building, and apparently red brick. And there are very few pictures even available in the archives of that. But they might have lived there. They might have lived in what was the original SAC building. We don't know. All girls wore simple, light-colored gathered skirts that were long, and gathered and simple blouses, and wore bonnets. There's one particular picture, which I don't have access to, or I'd show you, of the girls digging the trenches for the sewer being put in. And they're dressed in these light-colored, it's a black and white, so I don't know what color they were, but very light-colored white skirts, blouses with white bonnets on, and they're out there digging for a sewage system. So it was different then. All their clothing was sewn in the sewing factory that was in Fanny Crosby, and Fanny Crosby just opened up in 1923. So by the time Clara showed up in 1925, it was still a pretty new building. All girls attended school. Would not necessarily have been true of all facilities of this type. The first 8th grade graduation had been in 1923. But when Clara arrived, the upper grades were being added, and in 1929, when June arrived, Dunbar Cottage, which some of you may be familiar with, great big cottage there, Dunbar Cottage was completed, and the first high school graduation was held. So the girls came at a time when there was a lot of change in building and such on campus. Dunbar Cottage, which was built as a segregation cottage, wasn't in use while Clara was there, so I'm not sure where she was. In addition to schooling, each of the girls worked daily in jobs that trained them for employment upon return to the community. They worked in a sewing factory, which was in Fanny Crosby. They had a commercial canning operation, and because they had so many other, they produced most of their own food. They had a professional laundry. They had a dairy farm where they had milk and butter and obviously meat. They had all kinds of different animals. When you look at old reports, you find lists of the different kinds of animals they had, the different kinds of vegetables that they grew and canned. And so they were pretty self-sustaining. Annual cost per girl was about $23 a year. The girls, both black and white, participated in these work activities and school. There was an orchestra and a choir, which put on programs that people from town and from across the state attended. Musical and religious activities were prominent on campus. The reports read about different things the girls led, just as they did up until our closing. Ministers from the community would come out and work with the girls as well. Staff living on campus, as I've said, would have lived in the original administration building, that large white building. That also had a cafeteria, and it had housing for girls originally, had everything. And they would be just big open bays. It would be like Army barracks. When Fanny Crosby was built in 1923, that became a rather elite cottage because girls had to earn it. And there was a trustee wing and so on. We don't know. June probably wasn't there long enough to have earned it. And I don't know if she was even old enough. They were kind of housed by age. Okay, Clara was committed from Omaha and was on campus 3 years before her death. Her parents were both deceased, and in the annual reports, it was interesting. They had to report like how many girls had one deceased parent, how many had two deceased parents. That is not something that's gone into later reports. They would report what they were convicted of and other kinds of things, but not that kind of detail. There was no infirmary on campus, but there was an on-call doctor from town who attended to their needs. Clara suffered from pneumonia, and she died on January 4th when she was 17 years old. A funeral service was held in Miss Ward's apartment in the administration building. 3 of Clara's family came from Omaha for her funeral. We don't know who those people were. A quartet of black girls sang for her funeral, which would have been very normal in that facility. I doubt that they could pull together 4 girls. They had a lot of musical activities. When Clara was buried here, she was the first black buried in the Geneva Cemetery. June Meade was committed from Trumbull. Her family had lived in different parts of her family lived in Oak and Dorchester, Tamora, Hastings. So she was from around this area. Her father was a farm laborer. When she died, her parents and all seven siblings, attended her funeral. She was the second oldest, and her youngest brother was about 4 years old when she died. June died from erysipelas. I don't know if you've ever heard of erysipelas. It used to be really quite dangerous because they would have outbreaks of it, and numbers of people would die. It involved a lot of pain and swelling and red blotches all over the body. Historically, erysipelas was dangerous, but today antibiotics take care of that. Didn't do June any good, and it took her time. And she was sick like that for 7 weeks. That had to have been hard. The Reverend Harold C. Capsey, the minister of the Geneva Methodist Church, conducted both services on campus. The state owns 6 lots right here, but it's never needed the other 4. superintendent of the facility in the 70s and 80s, Don Best, had the markers, replace the simple markers with the headstones, and whoever's been the superintendent since then has made sure that flowers are put on them on Memorial Day. Clara and June represent the diversity of backgrounds of girls who came to Geneva for health, education, structure, and what early superintendents referred to as moral training. Clara came from an urban area, had a family who cared about her, but no parents. June came from a fairly large family with a rural background. Each had problems that brought them to Geneva as delinquents. But in Geneva, each was offered schooling and vocational training that many girls in the 1920s era might not have had access to. They are a reminder to me of how much every girl who came to the Geneva facility was a person in need of stability and structure, instruction, respect, and compassion. They did not have the chance to grow up and live out useful lives. Have any questions?
Are these the only two from
These-
YRTC that
yes.
are buried here?
Yes, absolutely. To my knowledge, none others died. If they did, it would have been probably before 1900.
And they just died while they were there.
They died while they were there, and of course Clara didn't have parents. Both had family members come for their funeral. June had a pretty good sized family, but so there's a lot of things we don't know about them, and those, especially when you're in a correctional facility, there's a lot of stuff you can't get to, and there's a lot of stuff I could have gotten to 3 years ago I can't get to now. So, but I hope as you walk by you will think about them. I always think it's kind of lonely to be out here.
Do you know when the rules changed about the marriage status of the teachers?
Oh, in the country, some of those things changed. Probably by the 40s, you were beginning to see changes like that.
Because it was just women at first and no men?
No, men taught, but men could be married.
Oh.
In fact, in a lot of towns, the school was fairly small, and if a man came to teach, every eligible female was checking out whether he was eligible or not. So he'd be a good catch, and at least we hope he would be a good catch. But yeah, the rules, and you may not know this, some of the rest of us might. World War II changed a lot of things for women because the men had gone to war. So they let women do jobs they didn't let them do before.
You mentioned segregation. Was there a lot of, they did not live together, but they went to school?
It appears from pictures that they weren't separated all the time. Now, I'm sure that varied from time to time by the person in charge and so on. Segregation ended in 1955. I've always been impressed how kind of ahead of the game the facility was in terms of education, in terms of, that and a lot of other things. So, the only cottage I've ever heard called Segregation Cottage was Dunbar. And if you know the campus, everything else is along one road, and then here's Dunbar. And Fanny Crosby, of course, was off to the east. But those two cottages were pretty separated. I don't think Dunbar was anything less. It's a beautiful old building. But I doubt that, they wouldn't have been on campus at the same time, but I doubt that they would have had much association. They wouldn't have lived together. June had a group of people with her. Clara, because of when she was, she does not show up in the 1920 census, of course, on campus, and she doesn't show up in the 1930 census, so I don't get a sense of who she lived with, or some of that I might have been able to gather, but I couldn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Back over here now.
You want to get closer so you can hear, Elaine? Now, don't be afraid to sit in the benches. My son said if people aren't sitting in them, I'm not moving them next year.
Oh, going.
Well, you better,
So
you better
sit.
move
Need
right.
some though, don't you?
Maybe I'll sit then.
Yes, please do.
You tell them this one's been used.
Yes.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm James Benjamin Barber. I'm speaking to you today. My wife and I are buried way up north, and it'll be quite a walk. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk in front of the grave of my daughters, Dolores Catherine Barber White Batipka. I was born on June 22nd, 1897, southeast of Exeter, Nebraska. In my early years, I lived in Geneva and attended school in Geneva, as my father, E.J. Barber, was the Fillmore County clerk. Later, I attended the Evergreen Rural School near our farm through the 8th grade. It was a one-room schoolhouse. I then worked on the farm, but I never finished high school. I did go to Lincoln and attended business school for